Let's dare to talk about something we may not even want to think about. Welcome to another installment in the Over My Shoulder Bible Study Series. These brief videos are designed to supplement the sermon that I preach each week here with the Missouri Street Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. In our 3-year church-wide Bible reading project that we call Immerse, we recently read the shortest book in the Bible. It's the book of Obadiah. Now, Obadiah may be short in length, but it's not short on punch. The essence of the book is that the Lord is going to judge the people of Edom, a nation, and he's going to do so because of the way they've treated his people, the Israelites, or Judah. It all revolves around a principle at work, which is stated in verse 15. As you have done, it will be done to you. Wow. Your deeds will return upon your own head. It should give any reasonable thinking person serious pause. It may remind you of something that you've heard of as being in the Bible. An expression that goes like this: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That expression is found 3 times in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 19 is a great example of it. Verse 21, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And why is that? Well, in this context, a false witness has been discovered. Someone lied on the witness stand, as it were, and it caused real problems for someone else. Now the false witness is discovered, and what should be done? Well, they should receive the punishment that the person wrongly convicted received. So justice is what is in mind. The punishment should be fitting to the crime. Another example, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 17 through 23, actually 16 through 23. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, etc., etc. Well, what is the deal? Well, here the point is that this law holds true not just for the people of Israel, the native-born Israelites, the Jews, but also for the foreigners as well. God's people don't get to play favorites. This is a principle that covers all of humankind. It's only fair. We're all made in God's image. So you're beginning to see that this principle at work here is not about meanness. It's actually quite the opposite. It's an expression of care and love, equally for all involved. Perhaps nothing illustrates that better than the text here in Exodus chapter 21. And it illustrates something else as well. Having said eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, immediately this is expressed. For example, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys that eye must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. See, we might have expected it to read, having just read an eye for an eye. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye must have their eye put out, but that's not what's to be done. Another example, an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. You see, this concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or receiving what you did to others is not meant for meanness. It's meant in terms of mercy and fairness. It's to express what's right. See, the judgments should not be arbitrary or random. They shouldn't be excessive, as revenge might seem to dictate. It's not to be less than what is fitting, as indulgence might desire. And it's certainly not to be biased, whether by a bribe or any other means. This is the principle at work in those who serve as judges among the people of God. And I might add, it's a principle found not only in the Old Testament, but is commonly found in the cultures surrounding Israel in the Old Testament era. Well, back to Obadiah, and not only the principle operative, but the story as a whole. What is it about Edom? What is it that they have done that has got the Lord to show up and judge them? Well, there's been bad blood between Jacob and Esau, that is, Israel and Edom, from the get-go. You may remember Jacob and Esau wrestling in their mother's womb. The story is told in Genesis 25. And things get worse as the story of Genesis continues. Years later, as Israel is in Egypt and they are slaves for centuries, God shows up and delivers them from their bondage and is leading them to the promised land. But they must go through the land of Edom on their way. And Edom will have nothing of it, which causes nothing but great problems for Israel. You can read that story in Numbers chapter 20. Many years later, Israel has kings once they're settled in the promised land. One of them is named David. And David leads Israel to conquer Edom. You can read that story in 2 Samuel 8. But this victory, this conquering, is short-lived because in 2 Kings 8, we're told that Edom successfully revolted against Judah and reacquired freedom. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about how much bad blood is going on through the centuries between these descendants of Jacob and Esau. Things get worse and worse and worse until finally Edom does some things that are simply unspeakable to Israel. You can read about some of those things in chapter 1 here of Obadiah, verses 10 through 14, and over a dozen other passages scattered throughout the Old Testament. We'll notice just a few examples here. Take, for example, words of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 34 and verse 12. Her nobles, that's Edom's nobles, will have nothing there to be called a kingdom. All her princes will vanish away. Whereas the New Living Translation words it will become called the land of nothing. This was years before Obadiah's prophecy. And then years after Obadiah's prophecy, we have the words of Malachi. Now, Malachi puts it even more forthrightly. Edom may say, "Well, we've been crushed, we'll rebuild." But the Lord Almighty says, "You can build it, but I'll just tear it back down again." They will be called the wicked land, a people always under the wrath of the Lord. You can't get one up on God. Well, more could be said of many other places. Amos chapter 1 is a good example in verses 11 through 12. The Lord says, "For 3 sins of Edom, or even for 4, I won't relent." Why? Because he pursued his brother, Israel, Judah, with a sword and slaughtered the women of the land. Because of his anger, he raged continually, and his fury flamed unchecked. So the Lord's going to show up and destroy the 2 major cities of Edom, Teman and Bozrah. It doesn't matter that they live in fortresses high up on the mountains, thousands of feet up, seemingly impregnable, feeling with great security. God is greater and will humble them mightily. Well, one of the most disturbing psalms in the Bible is Psalm 137. And it actually speaks to a situation connected with Obadiah. You see, Judah is going to be defeated by the Babylonians, and the Edomites are in cahoots. They're in confederacy with the Babylonians. Here we have some that were taken into exile in Babylon after Jerusalem and Judah fell, and they're remembering how they used to lead God's people in worship, and they're weeping about these matters. And then they call upon the Lord, "Lord, remember what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell." They said, tear it down to its foundations. And the ones they were allied with, the Babylonians, well, they're doomed to destruction. And happy is the one who really gives them what they gave to us. Well, what is it they gave? Wow. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Well, the Bible is, if nothing, transparent and brutally honest. And it's not to say that everything that's recorded is something that's holy and good. But here we have the record of someone who is honestly confessing what is on their heart as they remember with great bitterness the causes of their bitterness. Well, there could be much more that could be said. I'll only give you one more example here in Ezekiel 35 of how Edom is spoken of. The entire chapter is dedicated to the matter. We'll note just verse 5 and 6. Because you harbored an ancient hostility and delivered the Israelites over to the sword at the time of their calamity, the time their punishment reached its climax, therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will give you over to the bloodshed, and it will pursue you. Since you did not hate bloodshed, bloodshed will pursue you. Sounds very much like what Obadiah said, isn't it? As you've done, so it will be done to you. Well, now, you may recall that Jesus had something to say about this principle. You can read about it in the Sermon on the Mount, near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, here in verse 38 through 42. He said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evil person. Well, the thought continues, but that's enough to give us great pause, isn't it? What's Jesus saying? Jesus seems to be arguing with those who are twisting the Old Testament passages in his time to make them applicable not so much in a court of law, but for their everyday matters on an individual basis. In other words, they're living tit by tat with every offense that comes along. Jesus says that's not the way to live. The way to live is to live by way of love and mercy. And if things get out of hand, we'll let the courts decide those matters. But don't you try to take the court's matters into your own hands. You leave vengeance to the Lord. He's the one who will repay. Well, you may recall that I'm quoting Paul there in Romans chapter 12 when he says that the Lord says, I will revenge, I will pay back. Don't you take revenge. Ever you leave that to the righteous anger of God. Verse 19 of chapter 12 of Romans. There's more that could be said on this subject, but we'll wrap things up for now. The essence of this principle is really about fairness in terms of justice, that justice truly be done. As you have done, it will be done to you. There's a proverb in chapter 13 of Proverbs, verse 21, that sums it up all very well, the whole concept of retribution and reward in the Old Testament. And it goes like this. Trouble chases sinners, blessings reward the righteous. Indeed. Grace and peace be with you.